Created by one of our, one thing I did want to say is we do have several of our RIT researchers with us today. And one of them, Joseph Zorokong, who's going to be moderating our panel, is in fact one of our RIT researchers. So I'm thrilled to have Joseph here with us back, who's also a Fletcher alum. And I'm going to hand it over to Joseph. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Jacobson. Before we get started, I'd actually like to go ahead and introduce myself and as well introduce our esteemed panelists for this conversation. I am more than thrilled to be here, and I guess there's just something about this New England cold that you cannot stay away from, regardless of where you are. As Professor Jacobson mentioned, my name is Joseph Zorokong. I was born in Sierra Leone in West Africa, and actually immigrated to the United States when I was 6 years old, eventually landing in Lowell, where I grew up for most of my adult life and more formative years. And as you mentioned as well, I had written up a case study about my experiences in Lowell and sort of compared that with that of the Sierra Leonean population and other immigrant populations out there. So without ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists. First, Dr. Joelle Taos Taknint. Dr. Taknint is I don't know why I'm still standing. Dr. Taknint is a clinical psychology postdoc fellow at the Boston Center for Refugee Health and Human Rights. And we're very excited to have you here. And joining us virtually is Rachel Vinciguerra. Excuse me for my pronunciation. Rachel leads the Hello Neighbor Network, which is a coalition of grassroots organizations working with refugees and immigrants across the US. And right here next to me is Sarah Morehouse. Sarah is the author of RIT's forthcoming Utica case report and a current Fletcher Mulled student. I know we're all really excited to read that, Sarah. And finally, last but not least, we have Tabo Bo, who is a Karen refugee who immigrated to America when he was 4 years old. Tabo is currently a senior at Utica College and creative director of Nomadic Voices, which is a Utica-based open mic platform bringing together young, talented creators to share their gifts in a public platform. And so without further ado, I'd sort of like to just get started. One of the first questions I'd like to ask our panel here is, so we understand that refugees straddle multiple racial and cultural identities. So how do migrants in the cities that we work in and the cities that we live in, how do they deal with that? And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Taknint, Joelle, excuse me, and your sort of existing research about the racial hierarchy-based system in the US. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I think that the US is an interesting context to immigrate to. And as we all know, the US is based on a race-based hierarchy. And so the experience, I think of, especially if you're coming from a country of origin, perhaps where you have been in the cultural majority or the racial majority, the experience of then coming to a place where you suddenly have a minoritized identity, maybe experiencing race-based discrimination for the first time, can be very jarring. And I think that one of the other challenges that we have in the US is that we have these kind of set ideas about how we categorize people based on race and ethnicity. And so this can also create some challenges even within broad racial groups or labels. Something that we think about in the literature is ethnic glossing, which is essentially the erasure of people's individual identities as we assign a broad label. So if we assign a label like, Asian American or Latin American, that can kind of overshadow all of the individual pieces, individual culture identities that may exist within that. And so there's just, it creates a lot of cloudiness and murkiness in terms of the ways that people can identify within a new cultural context.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, as you're speaking, I was just thinking, Tabo, would you sort of just mind just bringing us inside sort of some of your experiences? As I mentioned earlier, you were 4 years old when you came here. And like me, I imagine you sort of straddle these two sorts of worlds and sort of that has an impact of sort of how you behave and sort of when you're growing up, like what do these sort of different identities, how do they impact you?
Yeah, growing up, I wasn't always proud to be, Korean because of the fact that, and Sarah knows about this as well, our people don't have a country to tell people, hey, we're from this, we're from that. And whereas a lot of other countries, they have a country and then you could tell that if you're from Burma, that you're Burmese. But it's not like that, with me. And I had a hard time struggling because I was born in Thailand. And so growing up, I would never really told people that I was Korean, which is my ethnic blood, right? But I had a hard time telling people, I was Korean, but I would tell others that, I was born, I was Burmese or I'm Thai, but in reality, that's not my ethnic origin. And so I would, I struggle with identity because, because of that fact that, our country didn't exist. I didn't like speaking my own language. I would try to avoid it as much as possible. I try to be as Americanized as possible so I could fit with other people. But now I'm a lot more, proudful of who I am. Like now I tell people that I was born in the jungle every single time that I can because people love that type of story, but as a kid, it's like, I was fearful of that because everyone else was born in a hospital, but I was born in a bamboo house.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And actually, as you're talking, I'm sort of reminded of sort of my experiences as well. It's funny, regardless of the fact that I grew up in Lowell, which is considered like an immigrant-friendly population, no one really cares to take the time to know where Sierra Leone is. So I think it's easier to just sort of fall into that yourself and sort of just consider yourself as the broader group, which sort of disassociates yourself right from what your true identity is. So growing up, I would just tell people I'm African, right? And here in the United States, I'm just Black, right? So I didn't want to go too much into that, but did you have any experiences as well doing this and the people that you engaged with as well in Utica?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, from what I, noticed in growing up there, yeah, that whole experience of like asking people, where you're from and trying to figure out how they identify. And yeah, I think like trying to fit into how the US really defines race and race structures. Like I noticed, especially with the Karen, like coming here and being Asian and what does really that mean? When they came from Karen State or they came from Thailand, their ethnicity was the most salient thing. And then they come here and they have to figure out how to navigate that path and what exactly that means and how to act
right
in that way. Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to forget about you there, Rachel. Could you sort of just bring us inside the experiences that you've had with your organization at Hello Neighbor in terms of helping people sort of navigate their identities and sort of what you've seen out there in practice?
Sure. So nice to be there with you all, even if it's only virtually. I'm originally from Massachusetts, so I feel like I'm back in Massachusetts with you all. Yeah, I think one thing that we've been thinking about a lot, especially in a partnership that we have with RIT and a research study that I can speak about a little bit later, is specifically the experience and understanding of what anti-Black racism looks like in the US and how refugees, especially refugee adults, are experiencing what they see, if they themselves are not Black, or what they're experiencing if they themselves are Black. And I think the point that was made earlier about ethnic flossing is really relevant to this idea, and like perceptions that in the US you might be, as you said, Joseph, labeled as Black, but people may not see past that particular identity. So I know friends and colleagues, for example, from Haiti have a very different experience of movements and protests for racial equity than we do here in the US. And others from other countries may have experiences of movements for different types of equity in their countries of origin that they carry with them here to the US. So something that we saw last summer, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, was that many of our refugee families were not sure what to do. They weren't sure how they fit in to those conversations. And, you know, if you're coming from countries where there is a lot of protesting and potentially violence, it can be sort of challenging to navigate. So that's something that we were hearing from families and that we're seeking to understand a little bit better, because certainly the US has a very different history of race and racism, and a long history of race and racism that impacts how our society operates today. And what we know is that in the refugee resettlement process, there's not a whole lot of background that folks get about what the history is in our country and what that might cause in day-to-day lives of individuals. So that's something that we've noticed and we've been thinking about and starting to explore with RIT and some other partners.
Yeah, thank you for that. And speaking of exploring sort of solutions for this, and I'll just sort of throw it out here generally. How do you think people are sort of navigating some of these tensions of identity, right? What are some coping mechanisms that people do have? And sort of to that end, right? What are the negative consequences or the sort of mental health issues that can arise from this resonance? I forget the word that you mentioned. Dissonance. Sorry, I forget the word that you mentioned. What are the impacts of this? Sorry, Dr. Joelle.
To me?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and there's probably so many different answers, because I think you know, everyone is impacted in an individual way. But I can speak a little bit to kind of what I've seen in the research literature. So certainly, you know, when people experience racism, we see negative psychological sequelae. So, you know, increased anxiety, increased depression, lower self-esteem, things like that. I think developmentally, it can be very challenging for, you know, kids who experience racism in schools and have social isolation, bullying. And I think that the experience of immigrant adults is particularly unique because children of color who grow up in the United States are socialized to by their families to prepare for experiences of racism and discrimination, unfortunately. And there's a lot of protection in having that. And for immigrant adults who are maybe navigating their identity as a person of color for the first time in a new context, it's harder to engage in those conversations with kids. And those adults are having identity changes at the same time. I think in terms of solutions, you know, I'm challenged as a psychologist because I work on an individual level. But I think that the solutions are really systemic and not individual. I think the individual solutions are kind of applying a little ointment to a really large wound. And so, you know, I think it comes down to policy at the end of the day. I think at the broadest level, you know, if we think about what our kind of immigration context is and how we conceptualize migrants within the United States, that's important. You know, we don't have explicit policies of multiculturalism the way that some other countries do, for example, Canada, where there's a focus on a cultural mosaic. And so in that way, there's no real broad welcome sign to say that you can be a person who identifies with your ethnic group and you can be American, and those two concepts are fundamentally compatible. When those concepts are fundamentally discordant, we see all of these other effects. So I think policy, and I think, you know, creating a culture shift also from a grassroots level in terms of, you know, not tolerating discrimination, both, you know, at institutional, collective, and individual levels is important. So I'm sure wherever we are in our positions, we all have a part to play in that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I was looking for the ethnic glossing, not any sort of dissonance. So sorry about that. And Sarah, can you sort of talk about Utica, your experience in growing up there, and how you sort of witnessed the city, both from like a personal and sort of what you're doing right now with RIT, how they sort of address some of these issues?
Yeah, so actually I'll start talking about my RIT study a little bit. So I'm examining how refugee youth are conscripting into gangs as a coping mechanism and a form of protection against racism. So basically, like, pretty much the same story that I heard over and over again is that individuals would come here, be resettled here, just be kind of thrown to their own devices, and they get to the street and then all of a sudden they're being targeted, especially a lot of the younger boys. They're being beaten up on the street. They're being called horrible names on the street, a lot of which they don't understand at first, so they don't speak any English. A lot of which associating being Asian, which again, that was kind of a new identity for them anyway. And, you know, because they're being responded to so violently, a lot of times they do end up conscripting into gangs, into Asian gangs in particular for the Karen, for forms of protection. And it is all coming down to this racial tension that they, you know, didn't really have an idea when they got here coming into. So in terms of like a solution, I think people just need a heads up before they get here of what the situation is in America, because they all came with this idea from people I've talked to. I know Tabo could talk to it more, of like America being this dream. Yeah. And we take refugees and we put them into cities like Utica, which is, you know, very impoverished, a lot of violence there anyway. So you take them from one war and you put them into another, one of which they are woefully unprepared for. They have no idea the situation that's going on there. So just in terms of like a solution, just an idea, what is racism in the US? What does it mean to be Asian in the US? What does it mean to be Black in the US?
Yeah, and speaking of solutions, Tabo, can you sort of elaborate on sort of some of the things that you do? I know tomorrow is going to be the Arts Festival, and I imagine that's a form of sort of relief or mental stress relief that you sort of go through. Do you have experience with any other solutions in sort of handling these issues?
Yeah, of course. But I want to elaborate more on what Sarah just said.
Please.
And Joelle just said as well. Because, you know, coming to America, I was 4 years old, but I knew what was going on, even at such a young age. We came into Cornhill, which isn't like the safest neighborhood in the area. And so, but with what you said earlier, I think what we need is policy rather than individual implementation, because my parents are super smart. And so my parents knew that, you know, the area we lived in weren't the greatest area. And so like in a year or two time, we quickly moved out that area into like a safer neighborhood. Even that neighborhood wasn't the safest, right? And so my parents kind of prepped up us to be in our best, I guess, opportunities to thrive and to survive. And so, you know, I grew up fighting a lot, but like I never really got into like any gangs or anything like that, because one, I had my older brothers that taught me better. And then I have my parents that, you know, put me in an environment where I didn't have to do all that. However, not everyone is raised that way. And so, and I think this is where policy could come in, but not everyone is raised that way, where the parents can overlook what they're doing and they have older siblings that mentor them. And so that's why they end up joining gangs and stuff like that. And it's sad to see, because a lot of the kids that I grew up with and a lot of the peers I grew up with, you know, seeing the news, how they got charged with like gun charges and stuff like that in fights. And it's sad to see, but, you know, I personally don't know any solutions. But I guess this is a good way to go into your question, how what we started is an open mic night platform where we go to different parks and host these creative events where people could come in together, and regardless of your background, you have a safe environment to be yourself and be creative. And, you know, we hosted events in all different neighborhoods in the inner city, right? And our goal is to do this as you know, everywhere as we can. But every neighborhood we hit so far, like people will come outside and watch us, especially in a small city. That's very impactful. So then people can, you know, have something to do and look forward to.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you sort of mentioned something that sort of brings me to a question that I had for you, Rachel. Tabo mentioned the thing about having parents and the importance of sort of parents and upbringing their children in, for lack of a better term, an unknown sort of complex dynamic situation, right? And I know that you had mentioned you had colleagues who are sort of involved in either counseling or sort of taking care of some of these issues that we talked about. Can you also sort of just talk about that and elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. It's interesting. I think the the idea that like the psychological or counseling approach is like an ointment, and that like there's bigger policy change at the macro level. And I think that's true. And then there's also maybe what I see as the meso level, which is all these community-based organizations and nonprofits across the country who are trying to fill in gaps that you know, that the government and that policy are not addressing directly. So I have a few examples I can think of organizations that have taken different approaches that I think address intersections of race, identity, and mental health in different ways. So one is Cornerstone Marriage and Family Intervention, which is based in New Jersey. And they do culturally specific counseling that's trauma informed and one-on-one or family partner counseling. And they also created a training system that could be used by other organizations, other counselors around the country, so that they could learn more about the process for different refugee populations. So right now, for example, they're really focused on Afghans and the Afghan experience and what, you know, specific things counselors need to know and be aware of in that context. One of the panelists, forgive me, I just forgot your name. You were talking about the open mic nights that you do in the parks.
Tabo. Oh. Tabo?
Tabo, thank you. Sorry, my memory is not great at the moment. And it reminded me of the work that Ahmed Badr does with his program Narratio, if you've heard of it. He does a lot of work with youth to create art and writing to process questions of identity and explore those things. So I think, you know, that's another approach. And then the final example I'll give is one of our network members based in Nashville, Tennessee, on the Hubba Center. One of the things that they do that helps, I think, young people especially navigate contexts around racism in the US is they help young people study for tests like the SAT and ACT. But we know that a lot of testing structures that exist are based in white supremacy traditions. So they still have to sort of prepare young people to take these tests who have college as an aspiration for themselves, but they also do education around the histories of racism that are sort of baked into those tests. So again, it's not, you know, maybe these aren't addressing the policy solutions, but at a meso level, some community-based interventions and solutions and work, I think can be really valuable too.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing those. And I should mention in about 2.5 minutes, we'll get to the questions, both from the crowd here and from questions online. So in those 2 quick minutes that you can think of your question, I wanted to sort of come to you, Sarah. We've talked a little bit about the macro, and then as Rachel mentioned, the meso. I know you've been you've been thinking about some solutions on the local level that don't require too much lift or too many resources.
Yeah, so, you know, I think in examining, like doing like a lot of literature review for the research I've been doing and having people really hypothesize and ruminate about solutions, like things get caught up at the higher up level for so long. And people who are ruminating are the ones who control all the funding, and then they hold on to it forever as they try to think of the best idea. And I mean, Tabo could speak to this more too, but I think, you know, some of the easiest solutions is like just getting soccer balls.
Yeah.
And not only soccer balls, but like a place they can play soccer that's safe for them. And there's a lot of ways in which very low cost that you could do that. There's a lot of research coming out of refugee camps in Iraq and South Sudan. And they have people who are actually unarmed bodyguards. So they're just people who just wear like a bright vest and they just hang out. And they found that's really decreased violence, especially violence against women, ethnic violence in the camps as well. And a lot of, you know, the people I talked to, you know, walking home from school is when they were being targeted, when they're being beat up. And if you just have volunteers on the street who are interested in helping, just standing there in like a little shiny vest, that actually will decrease a lot of the violence that's happening there. So I think solutions are very I don't know, easier than we think, and just getting caught up in these grand ideas and just kind of pausing things that could be done in the immediate. So yeah, soccer balls, safety, it's, you know, what I go for.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And so is it time for questions? Should I open up to the crowd? If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. And I'm not sure if somebody's walking around with the mic, or I can walk around with the mic. And also, if you could, virtually, if you have a question, feel free to post out in the chat. I'm not sure if there's an option to do anonymous in the Q&A. I'm just coming from we talk about practices, mental health practices. I'm from that, I'm from a place of, if I may call it, adaptive socialization, that especially refugees have to go through. And for example, like racism and violence was, refugees is not just endemic to the United States. It happens everywhere, right? Like even in the global south, the natives are like to some extent violent towards the aliens. And I was thinking like through mental health practices from that context, because we talked about, for example, informing people who are coming into that space about the violence or the characteristic nature of that space. But it's also about educating people who occupy that space about the nature of space that needs to be created. So I was just thinking through, and I'm guessing Dr. Or Rachel could answer this, or anyone actually, it's open to the panel. When we're talking about, like, for example, CBT as opposed to ABT practices, in our case therapy, you can involve more people, you can involve community practices, standards, and methods to kind of like, you know, build larger. So, like just to think through mental health practices, are there ways where we can, or do you think it's beneficial to build ways in which you can involve not just you can have like a larger discussion, larger involvement, and especially art, because then you can use different forms of art that is native to that space, art that is native to the refugee, art that is native to different, and through that build some form of cohesion.
I could respond. Yeah, thank you so much for this great question. I think this is such an important point that you're making. And I think that, you know, when we think about mental health practice within this context, we often are only thinking about it unidirectionally. You know, we're starting often with this kind of Western conceptualization of distress, which focuses on a kind of one-to-one treatment with someone. And that's not culturally congruent or relevant for everyone. And what I've seen in my training is that there's been this pull to take what's been validated for use in Western kind of Eurocentric contexts, and then to figure out these little ways to adapt it to fit with different communities. And I think something that you're speaking to, which I think is fundamentally, you know, equally as important, if not more important, is to instead look at what are the ideas about healing that exist within a community. How do people think about mental distress and the root causes? And what are the natural solutions that exist in that context? And how can we use what we know in science and research to elevate and validate and scale up those practices so that we are developing solutions that are more indigenous to communities that they arise from, rather than trying to prescribe solutions from an outside context? Because I think we have to be very careful when we do the former, and that can in and of itself be an act of colonization within mental health practice.
Can I speak on that? Can I answer that as well?
Yeah, please.
I think you bring up a great point with how, like, in Western cultures, you know, there's this one-on-one conversation to talk about mental health. And I know that me personally, like me talking to someone with one-on-one about my mental health, I feel like that won't benefit me as much. However, like in our events, we host cultural showcases where, you know, different cultural groups can, you know, show their culture in creative ways. Like we had African dancers, you know, Asian dancers, whatever, Asian poets, you know, different rappers and singers, where they can get creative and, you know, express their art. And to me, when I am able to do that and I get to see other people doing that, that's a mental distress for me. I can't speak on a science point of view, but just analyzing these different creative events, I could tell about that, I guess.
Yeah, and you all bring up some really important points, right? I think we all sort of hail from cities where, to one degree or another, there's some frustration as to why the money that we get for funding doesn't actually eventually reach the people, which is another way of sort of blaming the people who aren't coming to the programs that are being funded. And I think this is a good sort of a reason to just stop and say, well, who's at the table, right? Who's thinking up of these solutions, right? And are we doing everything holistically to make sure that we're reaching people that we probably don't fully understand? So I think excellent question, and thank you to our panelists for that. I don't know, Rachel, I'm making sure I'm keeping an eye on it. I don't know if you have anything to say about this before I move on to the next question.
Sure. I'll just say something briefly. I think the point that you made, Joelle, about group solutions and solutions that are based in the communities that folks are coming from around healing is really important. I know something that I've heard from one of our network members, Dr. Susie Ishmael, is that the translation of the word therapist in some of the Afghan languages translates to crazy doctor. So there's already like a big stigma around one-on-one therapy and support. But a practice like kite flying is something that's a communal practice for stress relief, for mindfulness. It has particular cultural values. It includes getting outside in nature, getting support from other people who are around you. So that's something I know we've been talking about at Hello Neighbor is, it's great if we can have counselors available at events or be able to refer people, but what does it look like to have resources that are more based in community ideas of healing? So I thought that was a great point.
Yeah, thank you. Were there any more questions? Yes.
Looking at ways that it's helped with an understanding within the refugee community of other refugees and migrants, but also with an integration with local communities and what's being done, and any of your thoughts on like sharing art and other youth programs to help cultivate that.
Yeah, sure. I could talk on that first. So I think a lot of the biggest problems, at least in the Utica community, is like getting information out that like these programs even exist. Even though there's a lot of languages spoken in Utica, a lot of the stuff just comes out in English. So there's this lack of knowledge that even these programs exist. And I found that when they do exist, it really is divided still on ethnic lines as well. So soccer teams are mainly Karen, soccer teams, are mainly Somali. So I think, yeah, working to figure out how to get information out to the community, to parents, to youth as well. I think that would be super helpful, especially for the Utica context. And I know Tabo could probably speak a little bit more on the information side of it. But that's something I know that we're struggling with and wish to do better for our youth.
Yeah, and in terms of integration, that is definitely something our city could do way better on, because I noticed that, growing up in high school, I have a lot of different friend groups. And so I was involved with like the Hispanic community, the Asian community, Black community, but there was little to none events where every of these different communities will come together. The only thing that pops up in my head is International Night, where we had it in our middle school and our high school years, where you had a night where different culture groups would come in and they bring their food and all that stuff. And I was always a volunteer. And so I would come in early and I would take little pieces of every table food and stuff like that. And so, but nights like that where, different cultures can integrate and share their food and their history is something that our city needs to recognize and definitely start applying.
Any other? Yes.
But I think as someone who's not a refugee, as someone who's more of a migrant, I feel like there's a tension between the diaspora and people still in the nations. And I'm not just sure how to phrase this, but how religion, how can that relationship bridge and be made better for both communities so that resilience can develop in both these.
That's a great question, and to be honest, I don't know the answer to it. But what I guess what I can say is that, you know, understanding, I guess, is definitely how you bridge the gap between any type of community. Just be open-minded to each other's stories and listen to each other's perspective, because I mean, at the end of the day, I tend to think a lot of us are good. There's more good than bad. So I think if we could just sit down and have that conversation, and I think we could bridge that gap a little more.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you because thank you so much for your comments, and I love that you're talking, Rachel, and all of you, about these different levels of response. So there's the community itself, like we're talking about, and then there's, Rachel, that you were talking about community organizations across the country at this meso level you were talking about. I'm wondering if any of you could talk to a higher level of intervention, as in to what extent cities themselves or town municipalities get involved, and even higher at the level of the state. So we're talking here about the US, but of course, as you raised, these are also issues that occur in other countries. Are we seeing any evidence that municipalities or state governments recognize what you guys are really presenting as a public health issue, right? I mean, if we think about racism and the mental health issues that emerge from this intersection, we're talking about public health problems. Is there any awareness that you have that these problems are being recognized by higher levels than community organizations, higher only in the sense of, you know, hierarchical? So yeah, just any thoughts?
Well, I can start with Lowell and sort of my experience with it. And to be perfectly honest, outside of the sort of symbolic, outside of the admission that you know this is a public health issue, I think there's just sort of either infighting or an inability to get the proper amount of funds to actually address this as like a public health issue ought to be. I haven't seen any sort of transformation in the city. And again, this is a quote unquote immigrant friendly community. I haven't seen any sort of transformation coming from the city. Outside again of things that are more symbolic, and when I mean symbolic, whether they be events like the annual folk fest that I mentioned in my case study, that includes a lot of different ethnicities that sort of come together. But in terms of mental health, in terms of actually putting the dollars in, I think it's more of a contention of conversation, as opposed to actual action being taken from it. So it's a bit unfortunate, but I've not seen sort of that action being taken. I don't know if anyone else from the rest of our panel has.
Yeah, I kind of want to make a comment here. So in Utica, we're dubbed the city that loves refugees. Like, that's very well known. Like, refugees have really revitalized the city. I think there's like 1 in 5 people are refugees in Utica. But that's the narrative, and that's kind of where the narrative stops, which I find to be horribly problematic. Yeah, they have rejuvenated the city. They're the lifeblood of the city now. However, when we just say that narrative, we forget the ways in which Utica's really also failed refugees as well. So I really want the city of Utica to appreciate the refugees they have as they are doing now, but then also take a hard look and see what they can do more for the community as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's important along the lines of what others are saying. Like, I'm really thinking about what some of the structural barriers are to achieving things like that. And so I'm thinking about, well, in any of our cities, what is the access that migrants have to elect local leadership? You know, if you are not a citizen, or a permanent resident, are you able to vote in a municipal election? To what extent do we have systems in place such that migrants can be leaders in communities and can be in positions of power to help guide some of this? I think where we often fall short is that we have maybe a host community that is trying to vision and think about how to create solutions without the leadership of migrant communities in that process.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Oh,
can
I'm sorry, Rachel.
That's okay. I can speak to Pittsburgh briefly too. I think a lot of what you all are saying is true of Pittsburgh too, that, you know, we're lacking sort of the dollars behind it. We're lacking the refugee and migrant leaders in our government, our local government systems. But I will say that Pittsburgh has, I think at the city level, attempted to coordinate and bring together all the different migrant serving organizations and the public schools and some of the public health organizations. And there are a few different tables that everyone sort of comes together at and attempts to coordinate. And I think it's, you know, goes a little bit further than lip service, and sometimes there are meaningful changes that are made. But again, like a lot of it comes down to funding, and the refugee leadership is still sort of missing. I know recently our organization was asked by the mayor's office to put together a document that listed all of the, you know, changes that we'd like to see in Pittsburgh that would be more supportive for refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers and others. And that they're, you know, the new mayor is putting in place some, you know, hopefully some policies and changes that will be enacted. So I think, yeah, Pittsburgh is a welcoming city and we have that designation. There's still a lot of room to grow, but I do think there has been a little bit of movement and action from the city level.
Yeah, and I'll also add, lastly, that although the city might not be sort of stepping up as they should be, and they're sort of tied up in this quarrelsome debates, I will say that, you know, at least coming from Lowell, the people, which is I believe 25%. Immigrants and refugees, they've done an incredible job of being self-sufficient and almost forcing the hand of, you know, the rest of the city in sort of accommodating some of their demands. And it's even gone as far as sort of political representation, at least on a local level. And you'd be amazed to see there are some like stores, there are some pharmacies or entire neighborhoods that are sort of based on like certain communities. Now, the unfortunate thing is that they're usually concentrated in a specific area. But I will say having that high number of migrants and refugees in Lowell sort of forces the hand of the city to sort of say, okay, we acknowledge you that you're here. And to a certain degree, that's sort of a good form of change. But do I think that that's enough? Absolutely not. Any other questions? Yes.
About the whole person and how does a whole person be a whole person in a sense. And to me, that's body, mind, spirit. So in terms of the body, mind, spirit, we've talked about the mind, mental health, etc. What I'm wondering about, are you experiencing any in your communities situations where mental health, physical health, and spiritual health are a community together supporting the immigrant population? I'm thinking what comes readily to mind, many cultures, as you mentioned, mental health is not really on the radar screen or part of a culture. So they manifest in physical health or maybe turning to their spiritual leader in some sense. Which are, you know, strong resources to be available, but the coordination of all three together. Any experiences, understanding of that, Cody?
Can I quickly address that, just because I feel like I grew up in this. In terms of it being coordinated by the city, unfortunately, addressing those, you know, on the mental, the spiritual, and the physical, that doesn't really, at least from my experience, exist. But I will say, in terms of like our community, I'll speak for the Sierra Leonean community, and in being self-sufficient, it's remarkable to see how a community spiritually will come together, will do things like every Sunday without fail, find a way to get like a church building, to rent out a church building, go there and sort of participate in this collective healing. It's kind of jarring to see as someone who also grew up in the United States. I mean, who grew up in sort of like an American culture as well. But certainly from that perspective, I would say spiritually, the community knows how to get together, and it doesn't just stop at church, right? So over the course of the day, they'll use that to sort of socialize the rest of the day and almost forget about sort of all these issues that are impacting them. It's really, church at least is a really powerful way of people to sort of heal together collectively.
Yeah, I definitely would like to add to that with what Joseph said, like in our current community, that is literally the same way. Every Sunday, we would tend to go to a church and we would rent out the church just so everyone could pray together. And it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't end to that because, you know, in every week or so, we go to like a different house to pray, and you would know that, you know, that we're praying at someone's house because like there'll be like 10, 12 cars right in the neighborhood parked outside. So I think that was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that. And unfortunately, it seems that we've come to the end of our amazing discussion. I want to thank everybody here. You guys are absolutely incredible. And I want to thank the crowd for being here as well. We hope that you've taken a lot from these conversations, and we hope that it doesn't end here. We hope that you take these with you and you know, you go back to your communities, perhaps enact some change. And certainly this isn't the end of the conversation for this weekend. So we hope to see you tomorrow as well. Thank you very much.